Evil Mill totally dissed me at her anniversary party, calling me just a trophy wife and saying nasty stuff about my miscarriage. Her husband totally shocked everyone and now she's paying the price. My husband, Mark, and I have been together for nearly 8 years. We're pretty happy in our marriage. But when it comes to my husband's parents, there's always some drama. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law has had it out for me since the day we got engaged. Phil was a sweetheart, but he'd always let Mill steamroll him and mostly kept to himself. My husband comes from a richer background than I do, and my mother-in-law has always used this as an excuse to hate on me. From the get-go, she acted like me coming from a middle-class family was some kind of crime. She'd make snide remarks about my looks, my outfits, or my shoes. I admit I wasn't insecure before, but I always made sure to dress up nicely no matter who I was meeting. However, it was never good enough, and because of her constant digs, I started buying pricier clothes just for occasions when I had to see her so she wouldn't look at me with pity. One time, I wore a white shirt she'd seen me in a month earlier, and Mill instantly made a snarky comment about how I was repeating clothes and how rich people don't do that. She sneered at how embarrassing it was. My husband did try to shut her down, but Mill would deliberately make these comments in front of everyone so I'd be blushing with embarrassment. She'd even drag me shopping with her and buy me clothes that I didn't even like wearing, but I'd always accept her gifts graciously and thank her sincerely. I always tried to build a good relationship with them because I genuinely thought she'd come around eventually. But then things started getting worse, and it became clear that their generosity came with strings attached. While we were still less than a year into dating, I landed a job at a really good company that let me seriously upgrade my lifestyle. Mark was thrilled for me, but when his mom found out, she was not happy at all. She started calling and texting me, demanding to know exactly how much I was making because, according to her, women in their family should always earn less than their men. I was really offended and told her that I was bound to earn more than Mark in the long run since I work in the pharmaceutical field, which pays really well. Then, she told me I could do this job if I wanted, but once I married Mark, I'd have to quit so other family members wouldn't gossip about how Mark couldn't provide. This cracked me up because it's not the 1950s anymore, and Mark never had a problem with my job or my income. I decided to talk to Mark directly about this and let him know how his mom was making me feel uncomfortable. He was furious that she had been contacting me and texting me about all this. I don't know what he said to her, but she called me screaming and crying about how I was trying to drive a wedge between her and her son and how I was the devil incarnate. She said she would never let Mark marry someone like me and that I should just leave him. I hung up and blocked her because I was getting really tired of her toxic behavior. That was the first major red flag. Of course, Mark and I never broke up, but it did make me wonder about the kind of mother he grew up with. Over the years, I couldn't completely cut off his mom because there were plenty of family occasions where Mark was invited, and I had to go too, and she would be there. She would totally ignore me and act like I didn't exist. For example, if we walked into Mark's cousin's birthday party, everyone would greet us. His mom would come rushing over to hug Mark and ask him about his day. If Mark tried to include me in the chat, she'd just look away, totally uninterested, and then switch topics fast. I started to pick up on this one thing she always did. She'd go on about her health problems, telling Mark how she was getting old and weak and might just keel over one day, so he really needed to look after her more, even though she was totally healthy and fine. It was so weird how she tried to play her own son to get some sympathy and attention from him. When Mark finally popped the question after all those years of dating, he invited everyone to our engagement party. My folks and grandparents were thrilled for us, but I can't say the same about my future in-laws. Mill showed up with a scowl, and her face dropped even more when she saw the ring on my finger. She started telling Mark how disrespectful it was that he bought me a bigger ring than the one she got from Phil. Phil tried to calm her down, telling her not to cause a scene, but Mill kept going on about how her son never did anything for her, yet he was doing everything for this poor girl. That really got under my skin, so I told her if she couldn't respect me, she needed to leave. Mill was shocked to hear that, but I knew I couldn't let her ruin the happiest day of my life, especially in front of my whole family. Phil walked her out while she kept yelling for Mark, who stood by me. Later, Mill called to apologize to Mark, saying she was drunk, even though we all knew she barely touched a glass of wine. But since Mill was apologizing to both of us, we decided to let it go. Then came the wedding planning. Mill insisted she be included in my dress shopping, saying how she'd always wanted to do this. It's worth mentioning that by this point, my patience with her was wearing thin, but she was my fiancé's mom, and I couldn't just be rude to her, so I let her come along. I did warn my mom and cousin about it so they were ready if she pulled any stunt. Just like clockwork, as expected, Mill had a problem with my dress. She told me how sophisticated people didn't wear so many laces and demanded that I should wear a more traditional white dress. I refused, and my mom told her that I was not her daughter so she should keep her mouth shut. Mill got pissed and started to pout in a corner with her arms crossed like a toddler. Throughout the time I tried on clothes, she would be nothing but nasty toward my dress choices. In the end, I did decide on a dress and we paid for it. Mill then came up to me and told me how she was glad that I picked up the dress because it made my arms look fat, and giggled. Hearing this comment, my mom, who had been incredibly patient, started to yell at her and admonish her for her immature behavior. I was on the verge of tears because no one wants to hear something like that about their dream dress, and I'm not even fat, so I could not understand why she would say something like that. We let her know that she was going to have to find her own way back home since I had picked up everyone that day, and I refused to let her come back with us since I knew she would continue to say things about me in the car. Mills started to freak out how I could not just leave her, but that's exactly what I did. While I was on the way to drop off my mom, I got a call from my Mark, who started to ask how I could ever do this to my mom, and how she had called him crying, accusing me of leaving her knowingly. I told Mark that I would explain everything once I went back home, but he continued to berate me, so my mom, who could hear everything since he was on speaker, let him know that he had no idea what his mom had done to us the whole day. She continued to list one by one about how Mill had behaved, and in the end, asked Mark if he thought this is how well-respected adults behave. Clearly, Mark was embarrassed since he had no clue about the whole story. Obviously, Mill hadn't filled him in on everything. Anyway, later when he got back home, he apologized to me again. He told me how he totally freaked out thinking his old mom was left all alone, so he reacted that way. I told him that I would never have done something like that if she hadn't been nasty to me all day. Mark hugged me and let me know that he would get it if I wanted to uninvite her from our wedding. At that point, I would have wanted nothing more than to uninvite her, but I was worried that Phil might not be able to come since his wife wouldn't let him attend if she wasn't going. I couldn't let my husband's wedding happen without his parents there. I mean, that would just be outright cruel. We decided to talk to Phil before our wedding and let him know that if Mill's behavior started to get out of hand, he'd have to take her out. He understood and assured us that he knew exactly what we were going through. I felt bad for the poor guy having to deal with her 24/7. During the wedding, Mill was surprisingly well behaved. She kept bragging to everyone about how grand our celebration was, as if she had paid for anything. It was all me and my husband's wedding fund, yet his family assumed that since he came from an affluent family and Mill always showed off about it, maybe she and Phil had paid for our wedding. However, during the wedding toast, Phil made it clear that they hadn't paid a single dime and that this was all a result of our hard work. He also talked about how proud he was to have such an accomplished son and never imagined that his boy could finally lock down someone as smart as me. Later, guests also congratulated us since they were surprised that we could pull this off all on our own. Mill's face soured, and she was clearly pissed at Phil. During the father-daughter dance, my dad and I danced for a while and everyone clapped. Mark was just about to take over when Mill came running up and said she had to be the first woman to dance with her baby boy before anyone else. Mark was cool with it and they danced. Later at the wedding, Mill came over to me and said congrats. I gave her a polite smile, but then out of the blue she said, "You know, your arms don't look that fat in this dress." Then she just walked off like it was no big deal. It really got under my skin, but I wasn't about to let her nasty comments mess up my special day. Everyone was having a blast, and we danced the night away, maybe knocking back a few too many drinks. The next morning, I woke up to a bunch of messages from Mill. I was totally shocked when I read through them, and she was going on about how I embarrassed her all night and how I needed to step it up if I was going to be part of her family. I was a bit hungover, but I remembered everything that happened. Just to be sure, I called my parents to check if I had done anything embarrassing, and they said no, I hadn't, and that everyone was having a good time. Later, when my husband woke up, I showed him all the messages, and he told me to just ignore them. I got a bit suspicious, so I asked him what Mill was talking about. That's when Mark told me that throughout the night, Mill kept coming up to him, saying I was having too much fun, even when I was dancing with my cousins. She told Mark I was like a wild horse and that he needed to rein me in now that we were married. Mark said all this with a laugh and told me he ignored her comments then and that I should ignore them now. But I was offended that she could even suggest something like that when I was just dancing with my own family at my wedding. She had no right to talk about me like that. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but Mark and I were heading out for our honeymoon, so I decided to deal with it later. Our honeymoon was awesome, and we had such a good time. The day we got back from our honeymoon, Mill called me and started sweetly asking how it went. This was super weird because she hardly ever calls. I told her I didn't appreciate what she said about me to Mark on our wedding night, and she quickly brushed it off, saying she didn't mean any harm. Then she kept trying to dig into details about our honeymoon and wouldn't stop asking if we had a lot of alone time. I told her to be straight with me since I didn't think our honeymoon was any of her business, but Mill just said she wanted to know if she was going to be a grandmother soon. I almost gagged when I heard that for two reasons. First off, I had just gotten married, and it hadn't even been a week. She expected me to become a breeding mule for her dream of becoming a grandmother. Secondly, both Mark and I never want kids. We had talked about this long before we got serious, and our feelings hadn't changed. We didn't want to raise kids, though we had nothing against children. Now, this is something we had never really outright told our parents because, at the end of the day, it's our personal business. I kept my mouth shut as Mill kept saying how I needed to get pregnant as fast as I could because my biological clock was ticking, and these were my best baby-making years. I was cringing so hard hearing her talk this way when she took it one step even further. She started saying how me and my husband should stop using condoms, which was an extremely inappropriate thing for her to say. I shut her down right away and told her I was done with this conversation. When I told Mark about this, he was furious. He immediately called her to give her a piece of his mind and truthfully confessed that we didn't want children. Mill reacted exactly like we knew she would. She screamed and raged over the phone and acted like we had killed her dog or something. She started threatening that if he didn't give her a grandchild, she wouldn't leave him anything in her will. Mark laughed and told her she had no assets since she and Phil had a prenup, so she couldn't give him anything anyway. Then Mill screamed at me, saying it was all my fault, and that as a woman, my only job was to give my husband a child, and I couldn't even do that. She started calling me things like faulty, which really stung. Mark told her to stop, but she kept hurling insults at me, saying we had ruined her lifelong dream, and if we didn't want kids, why the heck did we get married? Hearing this, Mark finally had enough. He told her he was done and she needed to shut up. He made it clear she couldn't talk to me like that anymore, and since she had disrespected me for all these years, he was cutting her out of his life. Mill tried to take it back, but he said he was going to cut her off and she wasn't welcome at our place or in our lives anymore. He warned her that if she ever showed up, we'd call the police and embarrass her in front of our neighbors. We knew how much she cared about what other people thought. Since then, we've stuck to our guns and cut off all contact with her. Phil tried to step in once, but after talking to Mark and getting the whole story, he backed our decision. Over the years, my parents and Phil have hung out a few times, and we never invite Mill. Thankfully, she's respected our rules and boundaries. Last December, we got pregnant by accident. We were shocked because this wasn't what we wanted, but we're in a good place in our lives, so we decided to roll with it. Everyone found out and called to congratulate us. Mill sent a bouquet of flowers and an apology letter to us. She wrote about how she'd really thought hard about her actions and changed after years of therapy. I didn't bother replying to her because I was still on the fence about her supposed new behavior. But then, just 2 months into my pregnancy, I had a miscarriage. It happened in the middle of the night, and I totally froze when I saw all the blood. I woke up Mark, crying, and he immediately drove me to the nearest hospital. They told us we'd lost the baby. It was heartbreaking because even though we weren't planning on being pregnant, we still loved the little bugger and would have given our kid everything we had. I had no idea how to deal with my grief because this was just such a terrible situation. Mark and my parents stuck by me through all of it. Phil and Mark's family called to check on us and even came over to support us. My mom stayed at our place for days because she knew I just wanted to stay in bed. Everything inside me hurt and I would cry for hours on end. Mark was my rock and I slowly started to feel better, little by little. Last week, Phil invited us to his and Mill's 25th wedding anniversary. It was a big deal for the family and everyone was invited. Mark and I didn't want to go because we knew the topic of the miscarriage would come up and it would really get to us. We didn't want to have to go through explaining the worst day of our lives all over again. But Phil begged us to come because he wanted to spend time with us and told us we needed to take a night off for ourselves and just relax. We agreed, but not happily. This was going to be the first time we'd seen Mill in years, but I was already dealing with so much on my own that I didn't have the energy to even think about her or her drama. Mill was pleasantly surprised to see Mark and ran to hug him. She was ice cold to me in comparison, but I didn't care, so I found my seat to sit down and let Mark talk to his mom. Later, during dinner, everyone was going on about their good news and how great their lives were, like people usually do. One of Mark's cousins mentioned she was pregnant, and it felt like a punch to the gut. Everyone congratulated her when Mills suddenly stood up to give a toast, mic in hand. She raised her glass and started saying how thrilled she was to be surrounded by her loved ones and how she wouldn't have it any other way. Mill then congratulated Mark's cousin for her pregnancy and went on about how she was bringing a little bundle of joy into the world, while others are killing children. She then looked right at me and started saying how she knew I had done something to the baby because there was just no way it was a simple miscarriage. Mark and I froze right there because we couldn't believe how unbelievably cruel she was being. Mill kept going, loudly saying how her son had settled for someone like me and that she had allowed our marriage thinking at least I could give her grandchildren, but I wasn't even capable of doing that. She announced how I was nothing more than a trophy wife and that she couldn't wait for Mark to finally divorce me as I was anyway not her family, so no one had to see me at her next anniversary party. She then cheered and downed the entire glass like she'd just given a victory speech. The whole room went quiet as Mark asked his mom what the hell she was doing. They got into a screaming match where she kept blaming me, and he tried to defend me as much as he could, saying how ridiculous she was being. I was so ashamed and embarrassed by everything that I just burst into tears. It was all just too much for me, and I was feeling a lot of emotions. Mill mocked me, saying I should stop acting because no one was going to buy my sob story anyway. Out of nowhere, Phil, who had stayed silent in his seat watching the whole spectacle, stood up and asked everyone to calm down. He said he had something important to get off his chest. He grabbed the mic and told everyone he'd been suffering for the past 25 years, and tonight finally made him see that he was done with it all. He looked at Mill, who was totally confused, as he said there wouldn't be a wedding anniversary next year because he didn't want to stay married to her anymore. She looked like she'd been smacked in the face with a brick. Phil went on to say he'd stayed married to someone like her all these years because he wanted my husband to have a good role model and didn't want to break up the family. But after seeing Mill's behavior over the years and how she keeps hurting people, he realized he's too old to keep going through this. Mill looked stunned as Phil told the guests to eat as much as they wanted, but he was going out for a drink. He took off his suit and tie as he walked out of the wedding. Mill started yelling at him to come back, but he ignored her. She then turned her anger on me, saying I ruined everything no matter what, but Mark told her it was all her fault and he was glad his dad was finally leaving her. That must have really hurt Mill because she got quiet and said she was leaving too. Some of the guests came over to check on me because they were worried. Mark's pregnant cousin came and gave me a hug. Since the incident, Phil has been staying with us. He won't go back even though Mill keeps calling him hundreds of times. He's told us he's going to talk to a divorce lawyer. I feel really guilty because I somehow feel responsible for all of this. Am I at fault for Phil divorcing my husband's mother? Please give me honest opinions only. Update 1. I didn't expect this post to blow up when I shared it. So many people have told me their own stories about toxic Mill, which is just mind-boggling. I can't imagine why a parent would ever act like this. And just to be clear, don't bash my husband. He's always stood up for me when he could. It's tough dealing with an overbearing, controlling, toxic parent. I was lucky to grow up with loving parents, but he wasn't. It's obvious he thought her behavior was normal growing up, and he's done everything he could to protect me. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who shared their own miscarriage stories. I am so sorry for everyone who's gone through this. I hate to say it, but I feel so guilty because I thought it was my job to protect the baby. I did everything I could, but I still feel like I failed, even though it wasn't my fault at all. You guys are right. I need to go talk to a therapist about it. I'll also join different forums where other moms have been through this tragedy so I can feel seen and understood. Update 2. Phil finally served divorce papers to Mill. It's been 2 months since my last update and Phil's been staying with us. He's a great house guest. I can see where my husband gets his sense of humor from. Phil loves to cook, so sometimes when I get home from work, he already has dinner ready on the table. Mill was really lucky to have him, and I don't know why she let a gem like him slip away. When Phil and Mark went to serve her the divorce papers, she wouldn't even look at them. Mark told me she yelled at them, saying they had no right to cut her off, and that she only said those things about me because she wanted the best for our family. Mark ignored her and helped Phil pack his stuff. Mill got furious and started throwing things on the ground, yelling and screaming. At that point, Phil threatened to call the police since it was technically his house. When she heard that, she shut up because she knew she had nowhere else to go. After the party, no one reached out to her except to tell her what a huge jerk she was. Everyone knew she had lied about me being a trophy wife because I made good money, and they also got why I was hurting after the miscarriage. Clearly, they all ganged up on Mill and made it clear they didn't want to hang around someone as unstable as her. She's got no family or friends left because of her own crazy behavior. She tried begging Phil, but he obviously wants nothing to do with her. My parents talked to Mill after hearing what she did to me, and they wouldn't think twice about taking legal action against her for harassing me and trashing my name in public. My mom isn't the quiet type and told her straight up what she thought. Knowing my parents, I know they'll follow through and take her to court, so I hope for my own sake she keeps her distance from me. It's been 8 months since my last update, and I wanted to let you know that Phil is a free man now. He and Mill had a prenup, so she couldn't take anything that wasn't hers. He agreed to let her have everything in their joint account and even let her keep the car. She was furious and kept demanding that he should let her keep the house too, but he and his lawyer just laughed in her face since it was Phil's before they got married. Mark heard that she's currently crashing at one of his cousin's places while she looks for a cheaper spot. I think she's got more than enough money to live a good, comfortable life on her own. Mill has mostly stayed away from us, though we hear from time to time that she's trying to reach out to people with her side of the story to get some sympathy. Well, she can do whatever she wants. As for us, we're doing great. Mark and I are doing really well. I went for the therapy I mentioned, and it's helped me make new friends who really understand me. Mark also signed up for his own therapy sessions to work through his past issues. Our career is doing great, and we're just thankful for all we've got at the moment.